Thank you very much, Alejandro, for this nice introduction. And I'm very sorry, but in difference to Rubens, I don't speak any Spanish. That's a pity for me. I can read it and try to understand, but I can't speak. So I have to speak in English. And I will also give my lecture in English, but maybe we can discuss in all our languages. I start out with some things that are thought to be facts, but we don't know when Rubens was born. However, it can be assumed that his contemporaries saw him as a citizen of the famous city of Antwerp. The exact date or place of his birth are not known with certainty. His first biographers consistently mentioned the 28th of June, 1577. This date of birth is first recorded in an engraving made many years after his death. And it may be the date of his birth, but this can't be said with certainty. And it's therefore impossible to say with certainty where he was born. For even though the family was mainly in Siegen at this time, his mother could have made trips to Cologne or to Antwerp, even though these of all places are not attested for the time mentioned. From 1578 onwards, the family lived in Cologne, where Jan Rubens died in 1587, where his mother had in the same year attested to have stayed there for the last 3 years. Rubens himself gives another date of his birth as 1577, so maybe he was born in Antwerp. But he lived in Cologne as a kid and went to school there. If one is to believe his nephew, Peter Paul Rubens received his first lessons in Cologne. In fact, as he himself writes, Rubens spent his childhood in Cologne until the age of 10. The family lived in the Sternengasse, and St. Peter was the parish church where Rubens' father found his final resting place. In Cologne, Rubens also attended the Latin school until the fatherless Rubens family returned home to Antwerp. In Antwerp, he continued his lessons. In a letter Balthasar Moretus sent to the brother of the painter, Philip Rubens in Rome, in the holy year of 1600, he mentions in passing that he had attended the Latin school together with Rubens' brother, the painter Rubens, and come to know and appreciate him there. From the preserved account books of Plantin's print shop, it can be concluded that Balthasar and Jan Moretus attended the so-called Paperschool from 23rd of April 1586 to 22nd October 1590. So if he attended school together with Rubens, Rubens was there at the same time. And it was the school of the Latin teacher Romualdus Verdonk, who was assisted by other teachers. Since the publisher Moretus not only paid the school fees for his sons in cash, but also provided the teacher with textbooks on a settlement basis, the subjects of the instruction can be reconstructed at least in outlines. In addition, the books used by Balthasar Moretus in class have been preserved. So we know Rubens' school lectures. Rubens and Moretus read and translated Cicero's Epistola Familiaris, his famous Oratio pro Archia Poeta, and the treatise on friendship, De Amicitia. In addition, at least the first 4 books of Virgil's Aeneid and his Bucolica and the Anthology of Terence and other books were read in school. And the books written down with translations and annotations by Balthasar Moretus teach us a lot of how Rubens learned on ancient things. These books were not simply read and recited at school. Rather, the most important classical works were learned in their entirety, or at least in part, by heart. The ancient authors were not only the models for correct linguistic expressions, but were regarded as a treasure of wisdom about life and the world. In the works of the ancient authors, there were hundreds and thousands of verses that brought a psychological experience or a rule of life into the most concise form. That's why they learned them by heart, collected quotations, put them in alphabetical order to have them ready at the right moment. This constant collecting, recapitulating, reciting had already developed into a philological parlor place in antiquity, which were also alive again in Rubens's time. Above all, however, the works of the classical authors were popular as guides in all situations in life and served as collections of exemplar, of perfect examples of human virtues and weaknesses. So when Rubens read Cicero's speech for the poet Licinus Archiae at school, the Oratio pro Archia Poeta, it not only helped him to deepen his knowledge in Latin lexis and syntax, but at the same time, this booklet was considered a lesson in practical wisdom. Quote, "For how many vital, vivid images and heroic figures have been handed down to us by Greek and Roman literature for contemplation, even for imitation." Unquote. But Cicero not only emphasized the example nature of ancient literature, but also taught that natural endowments without school have in more cases helped to fame and merit than vice versa. So Rubens had all this in mind. He read these books and had his ideas of mythologies deeply grounded in his knowledge of ancient literature that he shared with many of his contemporaries. So what Rubens learned was something that he also could use to become a lawyer, as his father was. And it was his luck that his brother Philip had followed in his father's footsteps. Such an assumption was obvious for someone from such a family. The fact that Rubens's mother gave him as a page to the court of Marguerite de la Ligne, the widow of Count Philippe de Lalaing, also adds to this. He should have become a diplomat, not a painter. The experience with courtly etiquette gained during this time also predestinated the young Peter for public office. If, despite of all this, he learned a trade, and not just any trade, but that of a painter. The early evidence of his drawing skills may have persuaded his mother to let him learn this very profession. The reasons for Rubens's choice of profession are obscure. We don't know them. However, they must have been very weighty because for a young man of his family and origin, the painter's job was hardly befitting his status. His educational background is obscure as there were no reliable sources in regard to how he learned to paint. Presumably, he gave up his intended political career around 1593 and began training as a painter, which he completed in the workshops of the landscape painter Tobias Verhacht, the history painter Adam van Noort, and with Otto van Veen. Even the earliest works, mostly drawings, demonstrate his intellectual ambition and deep interest in the art of the ancient world. The theoretical notebook he created at the time is also evidence of his education as well as his ambitions as a painter and visual storyteller. A single sheet preserved today in Berlin shows copies after Raphael and quotations from ancient literature on the front, and a single figure by the same artist on the reverse, combined with written references to Albrecht Dürer's proportion studies. Even before his departure for Italy, Rubens also made his first drawings from copies of masterpieces of ancient art that were available in Antwerp. He also steadily added to his early collection of highly effective figures based on 16th century prints. Even before leaving for Italy, he had a successful studio and collaborators with whom he produced, for example, those portraits of Roman emperors. Only 2 of those are by Rubens himself. Others are by other painters, and the paint used and the panels are just the same, so we know they are belonging together, but were not all done by the early Rubens. And he was a portrait painter at this time. These portraits of his fellow citizens show his own pictorial handwriting and teach us how he builds up paint and formulates an eye. And under his earliest works are many portraits. This talent may have been noticed by the Duke of Mantua, who in 1599 interrupted a stay at the Spa, which he found too boring by visiting the city of Antwerp. There he enjoyed musical life, and to the dismay of the Antwerp musicians, he never paid, and recruited artists for at court. Vincenzo I Gonzaga resided in the so-called Engelse Huis, which was also called Hof van Lier or Prinsenhof. In the estimation of contemporary, the più bella casa dell'Antwerp. Among the artists recruited at the time was Franz Probus, who served as the Duke's portraitist in the following years. Vincenzo Gonzaga probably also recruited Peter Paul Rubens at that time, who on 8th May of the year 1600 obtained a health certificate. Health certificates are nothing invented in our time. He had to have one to get to Italy. And there's written down why he went to Italy, because of his business, as it is said. He probably left soon afterwards. If we are to believe his nephew, he then traveled first to Venice. Vincenzo Gonzaga also stayed there from the 15th to the 22nd of July 1600. Unfortunately, there are no documents that would for certainty show us that they met there, but they met early on. This is attested by a document dated from 2nd October of 1600, which mentions Pietro Paolo Rubens among the richly dressed gentlemen who arrived in Florence with the Duke of Mantua. Vincenzo Gonzaga attended the wedding there of Maria de' Medici, his wife's younger sister, who was then marrying King Henry IV of France. Rubens remembered this more than 20 years later when, commissioned by the now widowed queen he had drawn at the time, as shown here, he celebrated her life in a massive allegorical cycle of paintings. At the Mantuan court, Rubens had to paint portraits, a task he actually did not really appreciate. He nevertheless painted portraits of the Genoese upper-class ladies on the Duke's commission, because he was in debt by Genoese bankers and he couldn't pay back. So he sent his painter to paint their wives for free. This was the reason why Rubens came to Genoa. For Rubens himself, painting portraits was, as he formulated in one of his letters, a humble pretext as an introduction to greater things. His courtly education, his training gave him special access to the rich and the mighty. Even then, he traveled to Valladolid on behalf of the Duke of Mantua to present gifts to the Spanish King Philip II or the Duke of Lerma. At the same time, a preview of Rubens's later diplomatic travels. In a longer, precisely determined context, a monumental mythological painting depicting a council of gods was also created at the Mantuan court. This picture refers to an episode in Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil's epic describes how, after their successful escape from Troy and landing in Italy, the Trojans came into conflict with the Latins. Aeneas then sets off to seek help, while Turnus and the Latin army attacks the Trojans' leaderless camp. The 9th book of the Aeneid describes the slaughter and hopeless situation of the Trojans. In the 10th book, we find the gathering of the gods depicted by Rubens. Jupiter, who looks down from the heights of his celestial abode upon the camp of the Trojans and the Latin people, is angered that war has broken out in Italy against his will. Virgil has Venus, mother and protector of Aeneas, described in the terrible slaughter and the sad plight of her protege. Rubens shows her desperately pleading for Aeneas and the Trojans. She asks the god not to give her son victory, but at least to ensure his survival. She is opposed by Juno, the wife of Jupiter, implacable enemy of Aeneas from the outset. She blames him for the war and stands against him. Virgil describes how the gods of Olympus take the side of one goddess or of the other, murmuring among themselves, but Jupiter ends the meeting off by ruling that the fighting parties should have a free hand. The fates will find a way. With a personified river Mincio holding a swan in its arms, the painting has a clear reference to Mantua. In the repertoire of figures, there are clear relationships to other early works by Rubens, such as the old sketch that was made in connection with the commission for the altar design of Santa Maria in Vallicella in Rome. Thus, one sees a similarity between the Venus in the Prague painting and St. Domitilla. The putti are also comparable. In this painting, Rubens incorporated his study of ancient works, such as the sarcophagus that is still on display in Mantua today, depicting the story of Venus and Adonis. However, the early painting also reveals the encounter with Raphael's decorations of the dome and the drum of the Chigi chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome. The Council of Gods, as other works created during this early period, are consistently linked by the stockiness and puppet-like character of the figures, which can hardly be described as lively, and the use of theatralic expansive gestures. In Rome, he gained a deeper understanding of anatomy through the study of ancient sculpture, and increasingly produced works in which he translated classical subjects into emotionally moving images that were admired by his contemporaries. In any case, all his paintings show that you should have the ancient texts in mind. A telling example of this new mythology painting that Rubens produced is a tragic love story of Hero and Leander, now lost in the original. Leander was in love with Hero, who lived on the other bank of the Hellespont, and because his parents did not tolerate the relationship, he swam every night to his beloved, who showed him the way with a light. One stormy night, the light went out, Leander missed the target and drowned, whereupon Hero threw herself to death. Rubens's composition became famous early on and was praised in a poem by Giovanni Battista Marino. For example, the leading Italian poet of his time. One of the various repetitions was even in Rembrandt's possession. In fact, paintings by Rubens were repeatedly honored in poems. Above all, however, he himself repeatedly took poetic works from the ancients as a starting point for his images. For example, after his return from Italy, Rubens took up the pictorial description written by Philostratus at the beginning of the 3rd century and transferred them into his own paintings. An example of a painting based on ancient literature was created between 1615 and 1620, together with Ozias Beard, who painted the flowers. It is a masterpiece in ideas picked up from Pliny and the Antique. The painting shows the painter Pausias and the flower weaver Glycera. According to ancient legend, she invented chaplets of flowers. Her husband, the painter Pausias, imitated her in rivalry, according to Pliny and his naturalist Historius, advanced the art of encaustic painting so as to reproduce an extremely numerous variety of flowers. Finally, he painted a portrait of the woman herself, seated and wearing a wreath, which is on the very finest of pictures. It is called, as Pliny says, in Greek, Stephanoploukhos, girl making wreath, or by others, Stephanopolis, girl selling wreaths, because Glycera had supported her poverty by that trade. A copy, in Greek, apographon, of this picture was bought by Lucius Lucullus at Athens for 2 talents, one of the most famous paintings in the Antique. This was quoted by many later authors. This tale was well known also in Rubens' time and referred to often. However, he was the first and only painter to depict it in the form of an image. Without having a predecessor in pictorial tradition, Rubens drew directly from the ancient pictorial tradition in his picture. His own picture becomes the one that Pausias painted when he put Glycera and her wreath into a picture. The flowers in this picture turn out to be painted flowers that compete with those of the famous painter Pausias, whereby Rubens competes with the ancient masterpiece that is no longer tangible. Taking up ancient pictorial descriptions and the artistic competition with great antiquity already had a long tradition at that time, with whose artistic results Rubens was familiar. He continued this tradition, and in competition with Titian, for example, he also entered into competition with Titian's confrontations with ancient paintings. This has, in a wonderful way, pointed out by Alejandro Vergara, and I can only give a hint to this fantastic book that you can buy in the bookshop. And this is my reason not to go further with paintings and examples from the Prado, but face other topics. Instead, I would like to focus on one of the most important commissions Rubens has ever received. In the late summer of 1621, Rubens received the Italian priest Balthasar Nardi, who was able to announce a successful to his patron on 9th of September. Rubens was prepared, he wrote, to Richelieu, then Bishop of Luçon, and chief account official of Maria de' Medici, to supply the French Queen Mother with paintings to decorate the cabinet. This was nothing less than the planned decoration of 2 of the Palais de Luxembourg galleries, the new residence of Maria de' Medici, the widow of French King Henry IV. Rubens began immediately doing sketches and tackled as his first possible subject that wedding in Procurazione that he had witnessed in 1600. He later revised his draft again, just as he prepared a sequence of life events throughout by the sketches in order to have them submitted to the Queen and to her court for approval. So in some cases we have 2 sketches or even 3, in other only 1. Only a few weeks before commissioning Rubens for the paintings, the Dowager Queen had returned to Paris after years of exile, resulting from enmity with her son, King Louis XIII. She now commissioned a gigantic cycle of paintings, 24 pictures by Rubens, monumental paintings, to be drawn to depict the history and heroic deeds of her life. As many paintings were then to glorify the battles, victories, and consequences of Henry IV in the manner of Roman triumphs. The program of images aimed to rehabilitate the discredited queen. After her husband's murder, Maria had taken over the affairs of state for her son in 1610. In the 4 years of her reign, she endeavored to pursue the policy of international peace. And her international peace policy was a problem seen in her country. However, it was precisely this success in foreign affairs that provoked numerous domestic conflicts. A particularly effective manner of visually legitimizing her controversial reign and articulating her current political significance was to visually document her amicable union with her later husband, the formerly popular king. This was not so easy, as it was not really easy to promote the life of this queen, because she was in conflict with her son, and Rubens had to find a way to promote the queen and not to provoke the king. The king had only seen a painted portrait of his future bride before the wedding, which took place in his absence in Florence, and at which Maria de' Medici was given to a French envoy by her uncle, who was shown in her husband's place. So it's not her husband, Henry IV. He only had seen the portrait. On the right picture, you see her getting the ring from her uncle. This is not really a nice love story to be shown in paintings. It was an open secret that this union was a dictate of reason and not of love. The bankrupt French king married a fat banker, as contemporaries put it, la grosse banquière. A first live event staged by Rubens in which this aspect played a role was the bride's arrival at the port of Marseille, which took in the early evening of 3rd November 1600. The king had not thought it necessary to personally receive his bride, who was setting foot on French soil for the first time that day. Rubens therefore shows the personification of France receiving the queen on the gangway. The sea deities in the foreground are a familiar motif of ancient poetry and Baroque allegory, featuring, for example, in Giambattista Marino's Il Tempio, where the Nereids and other sea gods help to guide the queen's ship across the sea. Rubens may well have known this panegyric poem consisting of 279 stanzas by Marino, who had arrived in Lyon on the 15th May 1600 with an English ambassador and had thereby recommended himself to the French queen. Above all else, however, the sea goddesses in Rubens's paintings attract the viewer's gaze, which the 19th century painter Louis Béroux put into a telling image. Of course, Rubens' narrates are something that finds a parallel also in ancient literature or even in French poetry of the time. But, of course, they are remarkable not only because of their position in the foreground, but for their painterly elaboration, down to the vividly painted drops of water on their spectacular bodies. Their physical presence and pictorial impact conveniently distract attentions from the circumstance that Henry was not present to welcome his bride himself. So Rubens used these mythological decorations to distract the viewer from the fact that the king was missing. In the context of the political climate which was determined by the recent reconciliation with the underaged son, she's still smoldering conflict with him and immensely complicated power entanglements. A great deal of effort was put into the conception of the political program for the decoration of the galleries. Rubens had contractually undertaken to develop and elaborate the pictorial realization. In fact, however, the Queen herself, her advisor and confessor Claude Mogy, Cardinal Richelieu, and Nicolas Claude Fabry de Peresque were also involved in the development of the pictorial program, whose complex allegorical meaning was conveyed through a complicated symbolic language. In the paintings, real persons and contemporary events are interwoven with ancient gods, with genii, personifications, and symbols, with the allegorical personal, in many cases, entirely determining the plot. The presentation of the portrait, the wedding in proxy, the arrival in Marseille, is followed up by a painting dedicated to the first meeting of the couple in the flesh. The wedding mass was celebrated on 17th December 1600 and preceded the consummation of marriage with the conjugal act. Courtly etiquette demanded a suitable delicacy in the treatment of this very intimate event, achieved in the painting through the allegory. The painting is clearly dominated by Jupiter and Juno. Recognizably portrait as Henry and Maria, and seated among clouds. The two join their right hands. Human presides over his divine union under the auspicious star. Though already brightly lit, the scene and the wedding goat's robe are further illuminated by the torch, just as the dark underside of the clouds is by the torches of the cupids and the lions that pull the golden chariot of the personified lion, who were a mural crown. In the background, the city is shown recognizably Lyon. This was Rubens' task, and this was how he used the mythological tradition to illustrate this allegory. The brief description should not make forget that even educated visitors of the gallery struggled with this picture and its interpretation. For example, the German architect Christian Friedrich Gottlieb von dem Knesebeck, who laconically noted in his travel diary that he did not really understand what this is going on. I do not understand it. There's a woman on a chariot drawn by two lions on which two cupids are riding with torches. In the clouds is Jupiter and Juno, who is pleading to him, perhaps for the fertility of the married couple's love. The misunderstandings, however, go back even to Rubens' lifetime, where shortly after the completion of this cycle, the author Claude Barthélemy Morisot did not understand the painting properly. In his Porticus Medicea, Morisot wrote in 1626, torch-bearing loves are sitting on the lion's-pulled Cybele's chariot. Human shows Henry and Maria de Medici, who have been raised on the sky, he in the guise of Jupiter, she as Juno, how the earth is subjected to the new spouses, while the cupids smiling at his easy triumph. Rubens, who has sent a copy of the publication after it appeared, was not all satisfied with. On 29th of November 1626, he complained to Dupuy that Morisot mistakes Lyon for Cybele because of the turreted crown and the lion-drawn chariot. Much could be said about this and all the other paintings of the cycle. Much could be said about the lions also. But at this point, I would also like to take a brief look at how Rubens' workshop praxis was, which can be well explained by this painting. Rubens not only made use of classical iconographic references, of ideas from ancient literature and antique models again and again, but also had a fond of workshop models that are repeatedly used in new ways. And for this example is the writing Pedro, very nice, because this writing Pedro is well known to us. We find him back on other Rubens paintings, and it's probably one of the painter's son, Nicholas, the younger one, and Albert, his brother. A drawing or oil sketch of this head is not known to us, has not survived, but it must have been one and it must have existed. It appears in another painting done between 1618 and 20, The Union of Earth and Water. The picture is at the same time, in the way Rubens paints these tiny figures, a nice proof of his interest in nature. One of the line-writing putti has dragonfly wings. The other one, those of an Apollo butterfly, recognizable by the red ring on its wing. The Apollo, or Parnassus Apollo, was first described by Thomas Moffat in his Theatrum Insectorum in 1634. This extremely rare species has its habitat in mountainous regions of Europe, where it is found only between May and the end of August. Where Rubens might have seen a specimen or an image of one long time, and more than 12 years before this specimen was first described, is really a mystery. No painting illustrates the reference to antiquity better than the Council of Gods from the Medici cycle. In no other composition does Rubens use a comparable abundance of quotations after ancient sculpture. The subject of this painting has also caused confusion among contemporaries. The Italian traveler Cassiano da Pozzo in 1625 characterized the painting as support for the marriage treaty between France and Spain. And in fact, you see doves being coupled on the globe in the background, where all the other gods look to. In fact, this aptly describes the content that Rubens was to paint in consultation with his patron, because Rubens was ordered, and now this is from a part of his contract, a council of the gods for the reciprocal marriages of France and Spain. Jupiter and Juno conferred to put Europe at rest by the alliance of France and Spain. Juno, as goddess of marriage, puts the golden yoke on 2 pairs of white doves. 2 of the doves are held by Cupid, which are placed on the globe of the world divided in 2, where the arms of France and Spain, with the assistance of peace and concord, Apollo, Minerva, drive out discord, fury, fraud, which want to prevent the effect of marriages. Mars wants to help the Furies, which is retained by Venus. This is what Rubens did. Rubens' early biographers, Bellori and Falabien, interpreted the Council of Gods as an allegory of the providence of the Queen, as did the caption of a reproductive engraving by Nattier brothers, whose title was Le Gouvernement de la Reine, has been adopted also by many more modern authors. But this is what makes Rubens and his mythological quotations so special. No painter has treated allegorical subjects as clearly or as learned as Rubens, wrote his biographer Roger de Pile. He went on, since allegory is a kind of language, it therefore must be authorized through usage and understood by many. He therefore used only the symbols of antiquity that medals and other monuments of antiquity have made well known, at least among the educated. The painter has not only incredibly artful in imagining the subjects he wanted to incorporate into the compositions, he also had the skill to arrange them in such an advantageous manner that each individual object is pleasing to behold and every one also contributes to the overall effect. At the same time, Rubens's remarkable pictorial inventions, whose contemporary perception is attested in many ways, are a good example of the fact that the intended meaning of a picture by no means precluded a different reading. Rubens himself reports on the diplomatically delicate situation that arose when the young king, Louis XIII, wished to see the paintings commissioned by his mother. In a letter he sent to Perez after opening the gallery on 13th May 1625, Rubens described how the king was shown around the gallery by Claude Mogy. The abbot of Saint-Ambroise was a master in, quote, concealing the true meaning of some of the depictions, so as not to give rise to a new dispute between mother and son. The fact that the abbot, who was himself significantly involved in the development of the project, was able to carry out such a skillful disguise, a dissimulazione de vero senso molto artificiosa, was undoubtedly not due to ignorance or true meaning of the pictures. Rather, the concealment was inherent in the pictures themselves, which according to the commission were to be politically ambiguous, especially when it came to the broken relationship between mother and son. Rubens was explicitly asked to create these subject matters with symbolic figures, figure mystiche, in consideration of the king, in order to satisfy the queen, and at the same time to observe all due respect for her son. The meaning of an image was discussed and negotiated again and again within different political and social contexts and spaces. Viewing images was a performative process. Rubens never abandoned the orientation towards classical images and the rhetoric-oriented ideal of imitation of well-chosen models practiced in the sense of surpassing them. This was the basis of his new interpretation of classical models and his new mythological history painting. Rubens' theoretical concept is expressed in a letter to Franciscus Junius, who had signed Rubens' treatise on the paintings of the ancients in 1639. In his letter of thanks, Rubens praises the author. I say that your excellency has done justice to the title of the paintings of the ancients. The illusions of the testing touch with the finger nail used by Rubens here, ad unguinem satisfactum censeo, originally goes back to Plutarch, and he uses quotations and references to show his admirance for the book, but also to show that he understood it really deeply. Special praise is given to the careful editing of the treatise, which was done with insigni cura et lima, with extraordinary care and the artistic file, quoted by Horace and other authors. For that which falls upon the senses, Rubens continues, impresses itself more sharply, sticks better, and requires a more exact examination, also grants the student a richer possibility of making progress than that which presents itself us only in the imagination, like a dream. It is the notion of the greater vividness, of the central perceptibility, which ultimately goes back to Aristotle, to which Rubens refers here and which Junius also quotes in his treatise. He says, Rubens writes, what can only be sketched with words, even as a triple effort, like Orpheus' image of Eurydice, will nevertheless often vanish again, and everyone will disappointed in his hope. The phrase "ter frustra comprensa" alludes to an often quoted verse from Virgil's Aeneid and lends more force to the image "ut Orpheum Eurydices imago conjured ab" in the text. The reference to the tragic story of Orpheus and Eurydice reported by Ovid could at the same time be related to the artist's own practice. Not long before he wrote to Junius, Rubens had himself painted the flight of Orpheus and Eurydice from the kingdom of Hades. The painting had been created as part of the paintings for Torre de la Parada. On 20th of November 1636, Cardinal Infant Ferdinand reported to his brother, the Spanish King Philip IV, that Rubens had already begun the designs for the royal hunting lodge Torre de la Parada. A few weeks later, on 6 December, he was able to report that the entire workshop was working feverishly on the execution of the more than 120 paintings that had been ordered. Rubens is very much occupied by this task, Ferdinand wrote. I'm told that he was already divided the work among the best of his painters, but he wishes to do all the drawings himself, with the exception of those he entrusted to Snyders. As late as January 1637, Rubens had acquired a new edition of the Metamorphoses Libris 15 by Ovidius, which he needed to concept these paintings. This fact can also explain the next passage from his letter to Junius. We can say from experience, for the monk is incapable of presenting any famous work of Apelles or Timantis described picturesquely by Pliny or the authors. When he tries to present it to himself in all the dignity, who among us will present anything not tasteless and not deviating from the dignity of the ancients? But each following his own sensibilities will serve some must instead of a bitter-sweet wine of the year of Opimius, and show insulted manners of those great artists whose footstep I rather follow, and whom I admire too deeply to say that I can equal them, even if it be only in thought. It was perhaps not just a humble rhetorical topos that Rubens expressed here. I can imagine that he actually believed that he could never do the same or even surpass the artists of antiquity. His contemporaries saw this differently. A telling example of this is the epithet Apelles of our age, Evi Nostre Apelles, which was actually used by every educated person who wrote about Rubens during his lifetime. His brother, Daniel Heinsius, already published him in poems as Apelles in 1609. Since then, the catchy phrase has been encountered not only in the letters by his friends and acquaintances, also in poems written by Dominicus Baudius. He was the painter Apelles, and he was also quoted as that by Jan Vos or Jos van den Vondel. The epithet remained with Rubens also after his death. And in view of the fact that Rubens reinterpreted mythological history painting from the spirit of antiquity, it seems appropriate to conclude here with a praise that Caspar Gervasius attested to his friend on his tombstone, that he deserved to be called Apelles, not only of his century, but of all time. Thank you for your attention.